Shane, Willard, let's put our hands together.
All right. Good morning, everybody. I'm so glad to be joining with you today. I've got just to give you sort of a basic overview of how I envision the day going, and I'm open to it going somewhere else. So I've got this first session is on personal growth and how to assimilate new information, and how to take something that makes us feel uncomfortable because it should, but allow us to grow, and how to decipher between is this something that's making me uncomfortable because it's going to destroy me, or is this something that's making me uncomfortable because I actually need to assimilate it? And there's a short period of uncomfortability as I assimilate this new information. And so we'll talk about that, and then we'll take a short break. I won't go so long that your rear ends can't handle it, and so, or your minds. And so here we go. So we won't do that, and then we're going to come back, and then I've written a talk on how to have difficult conversations, on communication skills, and what it looks like to sit across from someone, and you know before you get there that it's not going to go well, right? So you know before you get there that this is going to be challenging. So I want to give us some real tools around that. That's obviously there's some biblical stuff in there, but a lot of psychology. For those of you who don't know, I do have a master's degree in clinical psychology. This sounds like I'm making a joke, but my master's degree is actually in marriage and sex. So I am a theoretical expert, right? Like theoretically, no one's better than me at that. But in practice, pretty much crap. But in theory, you can't beat me. And so I'm going to be drawing on some of my training there, with obviously some biblical stuff, and then we'll talk about finance and generosity. I envision the day going to about a little after 12, and then we'll have lunch and take an afternoon break, and then come back tonight for a proper sermon, right? And so, but I find this more collaborative. This is like workshop feeling and collaborative. And so at the end of each, we'll have some Q&A as well. Let me define that. A Q&A has to have a Q, right? So if you're just going to tell me your opinion on something, not that I wouldn't want to hear it, but for group purposes, that can be boring. Cues have to be cues. They need to be non-antagonistic and mutually edifying, all right? So we're not going to argue. We're all on this sort of journey together, because especially when it comes to God, like somewhere walking the earth right now, I don't know who it would be, but somewhere there would be the rightest person about God, whoever that is. Somewhere out of 7 billion people, there is one person who is the rightest person about God. The person God's looking down from heaven going, I'm almost impressed. That's you, right? That's you. You're that person. Whoever that person is, I would argue, still hasn't scratched 1/100th of 1% of what God is. And so, and if they're there, then that means all of us are behind that, which is why you get so bored with the futility of people who don't understand anything being dogmatic about what they think God is. And so what ends up happening then is when we say the word God, what we just mean is, some people when they say God, and I think all of us are guilty of this at times, we just mean us with a giant megaphone, right? So we get so convinced that we're so united with God that when we say God, we just mean us with a giant. We just use the word God as an exclamation point on our opinion. So if we're not for something, then God's not for it. So if you're for it, you're not against us, you're against God, right? And which actually shuts down growth, right? And so I want to talk about the nature of personal growth. Now, to do that, we got to talk about some deeper things, all right? So if you could bring that first slide up for me. All right, so first, the nature of truth, all right? So let's talk about truth for a second, because we're all truth lovers, right? And you can always, you always throw up in your mouth a little bit with that person, who acts like they're a truth lover and you're not. So, the people go, well, I just love the truth, as if we don't, right? So let's talk about truth and why truth can be complex, all right? So truth has to exist in a trinitarian structure, all right? Now, what I mean by that is that it has 3 parts. So that's all I mean. And if you remove any of the 3 legs of truth, it doesn't become less truthful. That's very important. It's not like it's less truthful. It's just less meaningful. For truth to have its full power, its full impact, it has to have all 3 of these. And so let me talk about these slowly, because I'm feeling no pressure to be a real preacher today. And so I want to be more of a teacher, and you guys get it, right? So first there's the literal, right? And then there's the symbolic, and then there's the evental. Now, Sometimes that speaks for itself, but let me explain what I mean by that. All right, so literal. All truth is grounded in something objective, something literal. And what I mean by that is somebody wrote it down. Somebody told a story. Somebody experienced something, right? So in Christianity, which is our tribe, right, we would talk about things like, well, in the next 2-3 weeks, we'll be talking a lot about things like the cross, right? So the truth of the cross is that it happened. Rome actually crucified people. It's an unfortunate part of world history. It's terrible, but that happened, right? Resurrection. Resurrection is grounded in something objective. Something happened. Somebody told a story. Now, sometimes the literal is fiction. It doesn't have to be literal. It doesn't have to have actually happened for it to be literally true. Let me explain what I mean by that. If I was to take you to Israel, and you were to say to the history expert, could you please take us to the farm where the parable of the prodigal son actually took place? The history teacher would go, what? That was a made-up story to make a point. But it's still literal in the sense that Jesus told the story. So the literal part of the parable of the prodigal son is that Jesus told the story. So the truth in the story is grounded in the fact that Jesus told the story. But nonetheless, it's fiction, right? It doesn't have to have actually happened to have truth. Actually, sometimes the most profound truth is found in poems and songs and stories and things like this. You don't want to go about interpreting the Song of Solomon literally, right? That would be insane. Why? Because the writer wrote it as a poem. Like, was her nose really like a tower? Were her legs really cedar trees? Were her breasts really as big as the hills of Bashan? No. Poem, okay? But it's literal in the sense that Solomon wrote the poem, right? So somebody wrote that story. Somebody wrote it down. That's the literal, all right? The next, though, is the symbolic or the meaning. And that's where all the power of truth lies. The power of truth does not lie in the arguing about whether it literally happened or not. Right? Even like really important stuff like resurrection, right? Now, let me be clear. We embrace literal resurrection, okay? We embrace that, and that's important. But all the power of resurrection lies in the infinite exploration of what that means, right? Like if all you care about is literal resurrection, why don't you worship Lazarus? He rose first, right? But there's no such thing as a Lazarite or a Lazarene. Like, what do you guys do? We're the Church of the Lazarites. We don't know. That doesn't happen. Even though he resurrected before Jesus, we worship Jesus, not Lazarus, because the power of resurrection is not found in arguing about whether it's literally true, but in the infinite explorations of the meanings of it, which is why if somebody wrote a 57-page thesis proving Jesus literally rose from the dead and posted it on Facebook, how many pages into that before you get bored? 1, maybe 2. And here's the thing, you already agree with it. It's not even something that you would argue with. It's like, yeah, hey, Jesus rose from the dead. But someone focusing only on the literal doesn't make it less truthful. It just makes it less meaningful. Because somebody at some point's got to go, yeah, well, okay, what does that mean? A guy rose from the dead. Like if it was on the news tonight, someone rose from the dead, it would just sort of be a weird thing. It would be like, oh, well, is Married at First Sight still on? Like it would be, like, what is going? And by the way, if you like Married at First Sight, you have lost all your moral authority to stand for biblical marriage. Okay, now, I'm joking. We're having fun now. So. If somebody, all the power of truth is found in the symbolism of it. Let me explain what I mean with an illustration. If during the break, if you walked out onto the street here, and there was a sober person, not a drunk person you would understand, but a sober person going to the toilet on an Australian flag, okay? Would that irritate you? Like, would you be sort of offended, right? Yes. Why? It's just thread and cloth. So what if a guy goes to the toilet on a piece of thread and a bunch of cloth? Who cares about that, right? Right? Why? Because the power of the flag is not found in the literal material of it. The power of the flag is in everything it stands for, right? This is why when you see Christians debate humanists on YouTube, you're bored to tears, right? Anybody that enjoys this, I was watching this debate between this humanist and this Christian. That is so boring. And here's why it's boring, right? If a humanist was debating a Christian, right? And we've all seen this, right? We're all bored by it. So the Christian's going, no, this is why humanism is crap. You should be a Christian. This is why Christians are good and humanists are bad. Those ideas destroy things, right? And the humanist is going, no, humanism is awesome. Christianity misses the mark. And they're going back and forth like this. Now, suppose, just for a second, that they were both so compelling that they simultaneously converted the other. Right? So in the exact same millisecond, the Christian gets convinced and turns into a humanist. And the humanist gets convinced because of the compellingness of the Christian, and he converts to Christianity in the exact same moment. So the humanist has become a Christian, and the Christian has become a humanist. What has changed? Nothing. At the level of what they believe, something has changed. But at the level of how they believe what they believe, nothing has changed, and that is boring. That is boring. If the humanist becomes the same kind of Christian that he was a humanist, he's just going to find himself on a stage arguing about boring stuff. And if the Christian becomes the same kind of humanist that he was a Christian, he's going to find himself on a stage arguing about boring stuff. Because it's really not about what we believe. It's about how we believe what we believe. How do we take that literal and explore the meanings of it to the point that it changes our life, right? It's about how, I don't care really what you believe in general. Like, if you really are convinced that God is a 9-sided cube and the Antichrist is an 8-year-old Chinese boy named Tong Nguyen, I just don't care, as long as if I asked you, what does that mean for you? And you go, that means that I need to give my life to centering my world around the risen Christ and being compassionate and kind to the less fortunate. If that's what you got out of that, okay, amen, right? But if you believe something like that and go, well, I just believe it, well, that's boring, even if it's literally true. It's not less truthful, it's just less meaningful. So let's take resurrection for a second, right? We embrace the literalness of resurrection, but we also understand that the power of it is in the infinite explorations of the meaning, like death doesn't get the last word, Jesus does. Like new creation can burst forth in the middle of this one. Like you never know what God might do to your tomorrow that changes everything. Your tomorrow is not simply a repeat of yesterday because resurrection is at work in our world. You could get fresh starts, second chances, clean slates, new birth. This now becomes a compelling thing. What makes the cross compelling is not somebody tortured. What makes the cross compelling is everything it means, like the forgiveness of sins, the cancellation of debt, the confrontation to oppression, the idea that God doesn't sit high and mighty on a throne. We serve a God that identifies with our suffering. In one place, it's called the end of hostility, because while we were acting hostile to God, God acted with peace toward us. Therefore, we should be acting with peace when people act hostile toward us. That's where all the power of the cross and resurrection comes. It's not in proving it literally happened, although we embrace that. But if we stay there, we're boring. That's boring. What's more interesting is the infinite explorations of the meaning of it. Let me see if I can illustrate this with a story. So let's say there's a woman, and let's say she's really pregnant, and let's say it's time for her to give birth. So she goes to whatever hospital you go to around here to give birth. And there she is, and she's doing the labor and the whatever they do, right? And then she gives birth to this baby. So there it comes, right? And the doctor does whatever they do. They check it, they clear its mouth, wipe it off, whatever the doctors do to new babies. Wrap it up, and they hand it to the mom. At some point, they hand this new baby girl to the father. They say, hey, here's your baby girl. The father holds this baby girl and is moved inside and says, oh, wow, she's the most beautiful girl in the whole wide world. Well, what if somebody else was in the hospital room and they're like Sheldon Cooper, who only focus on the literal, right? And they say, really? Prove that literally. Prettiest girl in the whole wide world? actually, there's going to be a lot of girls uglier than her. Yeah. And there's going to be a lot of girls prettier than her. Actually, she's probably going to be somewhere in the middle. If you were a truth lover, you would say, oh, she's the most average girl in the whole wide world, right? That's what happens when we only focus on the literal. Because if somebody said that to you, you wouldn't even know what to say. You'd be like, what? I wasn't speaking literally. This baby has now redefined beauty. Like, it's not like her beauty has a meaning. It actually is rendering my life meaningful, right? And that's the problem when we get into literal debates about God. Because literal debates about God make us box God into some sort of meaning. But God doesn't have meaning. God is that which renders all things meaningful. That's two different things. God is not something that has, like you tell people, just come to church and get with God, your life will have meaning. You can't be surprised when they get disappointed with that. That's not true. God is not that which has meaning. God is that which renders our world meaningful. That is two different things. It's sort of like love that way. Somebody tell me the meaning of love. You can't, because love doesn't have meaning. Love is what renders your world meaningful, right? Like if you have nothing, but you have love, you can't help but experience your life as meaningful. But you could have everything and you don't have love, and you can't help but experience that world as meaningless. That's two different things. God is not that which gives meaning. God is that which defies meaning. Actually, if you read the Bible in a little bit of a different way, maybe, what you'll find is that when God shows up, that's not when meaning shows up. That's when what we thought meaning was gets blown up. That's the thing, right? Like, in that sense, God is trauma. Like, trauma is defined as any experience we have that we don't have a file folder for in our brain, right? So if you have an experience that goes against the way the world's supposed to work, we call that experience traumatic, right? And in most cases, when we say the word trauma, we mean it negatively, right? And that's okay. That's an appropriate use. Like if you come home from a business trip and your house is empty and your spouse has left, trauma fits that description of that experience, right? Because your brain doesn't have a place for that. It's like, wait a minute, what happened? If you walked into Woolworths and you saw a big giant person beating on somebody, you would say, boy, that was traumatizing. That was traumatic. Or if you've ever been on a really bad plane ride, right, where you thought we are for sure going to die today, right? You might get off that plane and go, man, that was traumatic. So trauma is any experience we have that doesn't fit the way we thought it was going to go. Well, in that sense, if God is anything, he's not meaning. He's trauma. Like a God that washes people's feet instead of demanding his feet to be washed, that's not how it's supposed to go. That's trauma. A God that forgives people without any ritual, without them having any means to do ritual, that's not how it's supposed to go. That's trauma. A God that forgives people who just put nails in his hands, that's not how it's supposed to go. That's trauma. A God that is still thinking about other people even though they are torturing him, that's not how it's supposed to go. That's trauma. That if anything, God is trauma. When Jesus interjected himself into people's worlds, he didn't bring meaning to their world. He brought trauma. He actually took what they thought meaning was and flipped it upside down on its head. In that sense, God is not the Band-Aid of meaning that we put over our traumas. God is the trauma, right? And so if somebody says to me, why does Surf City exist? Why do you exist in the world? What's the point? I think one of the points of Surf City is to be traumatic, is to be trauma for our world. Like when somebody deserves vengeance and you give them kindness, you have become trauma. And when we become trauma, we are the presence of God in that world, right? Like God is not someone we love. Like when I hear people talk about, oh, I just love God, man, I just love God. I'm like, what do you mean by like how do you love God? God is not someone we love. God is someone we find in the act of love itself. So when we engage in the experience of God by being the trauma, in that moment, we are being the presence of God for our world, and that's where we find God. Because you'll never find this in the Bible, ever. You'll never find this in the Bible, that when you love one another, you are loving God. That you'll never find that in there, okay? Right? I'm joking. That's like the main thing, right? Like that's a main theme in Scripture, that you love God by loving your fellow man. As a matter of fact, Jeremiah said, when you do something for someone who could do nothing in return for you, it is then that you get to know God, right? So when we become the trauma, it's actually in that moment that we get to know God better ourselves, and our world gets a better picture of what God is, right? So you've got we are preaching a little bit now, right? So you got the literal, and then you got the symbolic. The third level is the evental nature of truth. So the evental nature of truth is something has happened that we don't just believe in, but that something that happened has now fundamentally shifted the way we see all other happenings after that, right? So the cross and resurrection should not be something we believe in. The cross and resurrection, it should be more profound than that. The cross and resurrection should be something we believe in that then fundamentally shifts the way we see all other happenings after that. It fundamentally shifts the way we see our whole world. Let me see if I can go back to the baby for a second. Woman gives birth to a baby. Father says she's the most beautiful girl in the whole world. Sheldon Cooper says that's not literally true. The father realizes there's a difference between literal truth and symbolic truth, right? So let's say, because of hospital overcrowding, that there's two women in the same delivery room, and they both give birth at the exact same time. And at the exact same moment, both babies are handed to the fathers. And at the exact same moment, both fathers say, this is the most beautiful girl in the whole world. Are those two people in conflict? Is this now going to require a debate between the two, debating the literal aspects of beauty? No, they're both speaking in terms of meaning. But let's say, on your way home from the hospital, you pass a neighbor's house, 10 doors down. You've never met that neighbor. 10 doors down, don't know who they are, but they have a poster in their front yard, and it says, "Welcome to the world, Billy," with blue balloons. You would make an assumption that the woman in that house has had a baby, and that baby's name is Billy, right? And you can fully affirm the literal nature of that new life without it meaning one thing to you. You could actually go to your home and never have one more thought about Billy ever, right? But fully affirm if someone asked you, hey, do you believe that lady had a baby named Billy? Yes, I do. Why? Because there was a sign and balloons, right? And so there's a way that we can literally affirm the presence of new life without that new life meaning anything to us. But your baby, you affirm its presence, and it means everything to you. She's the most important person in the whole world to you now. But let's say that your nightly routine socially is to throw darts. So you belong to a dart club, and you're really into this. Nothing wrong with that. So you go home, you drop the baby off with your wife, and you go out and you throw darts. And you come home. Night 2, you go out, you throw darts. You come home. Night 3, you go out, you throw darts. You come home. 4th night, your wife says, excuse me, we have a new baby now. And you go, I know. And I fully believe in the presence of that baby. And not only that, that baby means the whole world to me. But until the presence of that new life has fundamentally shifted the way we see our whole world, then the presence of that baby, it's not less life, it's just less meaningful. It's not less truthful, it's just less meaningful. So as a communicator, if you've ever been frustrated with the level at which people get what you're saying, right? If you've ever been frustrated, like you're like, I know that I said that decently well, but they're not just getting it. If I could make one suggestion on the way we communicate truth, we all tend to focus on one of those three. And if you focus too much on the evental nature of truth without grounding it in something, it's harder for people to get. It's not less truthful, it's just less meaningful. If you focus too much on the literal nature of truth without exploring the meanings and the evental nature of it, people are going to be cross-eyed bored, right? People who like that kind of stuff are not people you want to hang out with. They're boring, okay? But here's the thing, right? All of us have a bent to, if I could just prove it. Because here's the thing. You don't see the world as it is. You see the world as you are, right? So if you're the type of person that once you see the literal truth of something, you automatically explore the meanings and then try to change your life, then you might assume that people will do the same, but they won't. And so we can tend to focus sometimes too much on the literal without exploring the meanings of the evental. Or you could focus too much on the evental nature, and people are going, why would I do that? Right? Why would I live? Why would I give to the poor? That makes no sense. It's going to make me poorer. Like, why would I do that? They can't pay me back. Why would I do that? Without grounding it in something. Or if you explore the meanings of something with no literal grounding and no evental application, now you're just sort of airy. Like, that is odd. But when you can combine all three, what you have is a meaningful truth. Without it, it's still the truth. It's just not as meaningful. So as we learn to grow, we have to learn to express and explore all three elements of these truths. Now, let's talk about another thing. Next slide. The nature of being. So the nature of truth is literal, symbolic, evental. The nature of being is oneness, sameness, and multifaceted nature. So let's talk about those three things. One of the things that make Christianity unique, Christians in the first century were killed. And the charge for killing them, that what they were charged with in court was atheism. So when a Christian was killed in the first century, they were killed for atheism. Okay? So when people say, we need to get back to our first century roots, that means to reclaim our atheist roots. Okay? But here's the reason why. They lived in the Roman Empire. The Romans gave the followers of Judaism, they gave them a pass because they paid a lot of taxes. So what they did with Christians is they said, are you a follower of Judaism? Christians would say, no, we're actually reimagining. We think God's bigger than that. Okay, so you don't follow Judaism. No, we think God's bigger than that. And you deny the presence of Roman gods. Yes. So you don't follow Judaism and you don't follow Roman gods. No, well, that means you're an atheist. You don't believe God exists at all, and that would be dangerous for our world. So they killed them, right? And so because one of the things that made Christianity unique was Christianity in the New Testament made a proclamation that is odd, and that is this, that God is the ground of being. Let me explain what I mean by that. That if it's alive, God is the source of all living things. Okay? So in Christ is in all and is in all things. In Ephesians, it's the Spirit of the risen Christ is filling everything in every way. In him all things were created, and in him all things hold together. So in their attempt to name God, they couldn't name God, so they just threw their arms up in the air and said, well, God is in everything. God, if it's alive, God is in all things. And so then that's literally true, but in the meaning of it, Paul was like, if there's only one God and God is holding all things together, then I can't hurt you. If I purposely hurt you, then I'm hurting myself, because the same energy, the same Spirit is holding us all together. We can't do that. So they proclaim something called oneness. Now, here's the problem with oneness. Oneness can easily be heard as sameness, right? But the rabbis did not proclaim sameness. They proclaimed oneness. Jesus, Paul, James, none of these guys expected everyone to be the same, but they expected everyone to see us as one. That the idea is I cannot purposely hurt you, even if you're different than me, without expecting to hurt myself, because the same Spirit of God is holding us all together. This has a massive ramification for our world, because you can't shoot up a group of people in a mosque without believing that there's somehow less of God in them than in us, right? You have to have an us and them mentality to be able to do something like that, to purposely hurt somebody. But what Paul was shooting for was, if there's only one God, then God is holding the whole thing together, whether that group of people can name it or not. Doesn't matter. God is holding us all together. And if we treat the world as if God is holding the whole thing together, then we'll treat each other more kindly without expecting sameness. And this is what stunts growth. When we honor oneness with let me say it this way. When we honor oneness, but yet we expect sameness, then if it's not like me, I can't learn from them. I can't learn from that person if it's not like me. And this thing. I had a pastor ask me not too long ago, actually. He said, Shane, tell me my biggest weakness as you see it. To which I went, you serious? Because I have a job, see, and you're my customer, right? And so there's this tension I have to hold between telling the raw truth and never being asked back again, right? So but we're good friends. He said, no, I'm serious. Tell me what you see as my biggest weakness. And I said, tell me the last 5 books you read. And he went, are you saying I don't read? I said, no. I'm asking you the last 5 books you read. We might can add insecurity to this list because I was simply making a point about the last 5 books you read. So he named them. And they were all authors from his tribe. I said, at the end of all 5 of those books, did you not just close the book and say, amen? That was so refreshing. He said, yes. I said, that's your biggest weakness, is you don't read things that you disagree with and make you wrestle, right? Because what you call oneness, you're actually expecting sameness. And to his credit, he received that. He said, give me 5 books to read that'll stretch me. I said, okay. Just, can we go ahead and get my date for the next 3 years, right? But I'm joking. He's had me forever. But the truth of it is that when we call sameness oneness, it stunts growth, because what that means is that I can't read anything I disagree with. I can't listen to someone I disagree with. And this is rampant in the church. I had somebody tell me, this was recently, and they thought I was going to applaud them. They said, Shane, I was listening to this preacher the other day, and he said something wrong, so I just shut him off. I'll never listen to him again. And I was like, are you 7? Like, what is wrong with you? Like, you can't listen to something you disagree with, because honestly, that means you believe you've already arrived at some level of truth that makes you the filter for it, and then you're going to be frustrated while you're stuck? Of course you're stuck. If you can't integrate new information because of sameness. So let's explore this a little bit. Next slide. There's belief, and then there's imagination. There's values, and then there's behavior. Let me explain what I mean. The philosophical terms for this is orthodoxy, which is right belief, versus orthopraxy, which is right practice. It is perfectly possible to believe all the right things and yet our practice be not affected, right? Totally, 100%. What percentage of Christians would believe with all of their heart that they are meant to take care of the poor when they have the chance and have the opportunity and the means? All of them, if they're paying attention. What percentage of Christians actually engage in that activity on an intentional, regular basis? Very small percentage. So it's possible to believe something and it not affect the eventual nature of it. And it's not less truthful, it's just less meaningful. It's just a pamphlet it's a bullet point on a pamphlet that we go, this is what we believe. Boring, right? Why? Because there has to be a pathway from orthodoxy to orthopraxy. Has to. And what is the thing that bridges the gap between those things? Imagination. What's more important than what you believe is how you picture what you believe working out. Okay? Let me explain. All of us would believe that we are fully forgiven by the finished work of Jesus. All of us. But if we imagine ourselves guilty, our emotions will tie to the imagination more than it will what we say we believe. So we'll feel guilty, right? I'll give you another, this is a great example. How many of us would believe that God does not exist as a singularity? Rather, God exists as a divine relationship between 3. 100%. That is Orthodox Christianity forever. It's also, they don't call it the Trinity in Judaism. You wouldn't do that. They call it something else. But every noun, every verb, every pronoun in Genesis 1 describing God are all plural. Let us make man in our image, male and female. Let's make them in our image. Actually, even the first verse, in the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. In Hebrew, it says, Bereshit bara Elohim. Elohim is plural. It actually is in the beginning, God's created the heavens and the earth. Now, you'll never see it translated that way because people could not handle it. But it's not because they couldn't handle it doctrinally. They all believe that God is not a singularity. But what if for the next year, we replaced every pronoun about God with the plural? how would people act in our churches? You imagine that? What if we said, oh, thank you, God. Thank you. Thanks that they are here. Right? Right? Is that doctrinally correct? Yes. So what does it violate? It doesn't violate the doctrine. It violates the imagination. Now, as a communicator, you're normally not shifting people's doctrines. What you're shifting is how they think about that doctrine, how they picture it. So all over the world, here's what I've asked. I've asked more than 10,000 people this. When you pray, what do you picture? Number one answer, a guy on a throne, right? A single white dude on a throne? That's Zeus. That's Apollo. That's Hermes, right? This is Adonis. This is Attis. This is Horus. These are so it's possible to have an orthodox doctrine but a pagan imagination, right? It's possible to have an orthodox doctrine but a pagan imagination, right? Number two answer, I just picture Jesus. Okay, what kind of Jesus? Like blonde hair, blue-eyed, sweet-smelling of lavender and Dial soap Jesus? Like that Jesus? Or like Middle Eastern swarthy hippie Jesus? You know? Which Jesus? Not just Jesus. Number three answer, I picture a father. What kind of father? You know, I don't know. Like a father. So like an ambiguous father. Yeah. Which that would be a good song, right? You're an ambiguous father. It's who you are. Right? Come on. Right? So what happens is, here's the problem with all three of those. All three are singularities. So we believe in Trinity, but we picture singularities, and we expect not to have something. See, often what makes us uncomfortable, it's not a demon, and it's not wickedness, it's not disrepair. It's some new idea is violating our imagination of what we thought, not the doctrine itself. And so we have to be able to distinguish between those two things. Because if you have an orthodox doctrine but a pagan imagination, how could you possibly expect to get somewhere that even resembles meaningful truth? It cannot be. As communicators and as people facilitating people's growth, most of the time what's making people uncomfortable is not a challenge to the doctrine. It's a challenge to the imagination of how that doctrine works, right? Particularly the English word God, right? You start violating, you start challenging what people picture God to be, and they'll say, you're challenging God. No, you're not. You're challenging their picture of God, and that is two different things. That is two different things. I mean, the number of white Christians that have thought that God is somehow a holy word. Actually, the English word God, the actual English word, was derived from the German deity Gott, which was a pagan god. So when the English language was being formed, they said, what are we going to call our deity? They said, well, let's call him God, which was just derived from the German deity Gott, right? And so it's not like the title we give to God has some sort of more holy meaning than the title other people gave to God. And actually, Paul had no trouble using the Greek word theos, which they used for all kinds of gods, to define what Jesus was to the world, right? It's not that big of a deal. The truth of it is that when we start violating people's imagination around God, people call it, you are violating God, but you're not, you're violating the imagination. So the biggest part of personal growth is not changing our beliefs. It's being willing to challenge our imagination of how that belief works. And that requires people giving us new pictures, new images that we're willing to wrestle with. Now, with that as the background, let's talk about some implications for this. Next slide. Since we are all one but not the same, how we navigate diverse facets with others matters greatly. How do we process difference while honoring oneness? Let me say it another way. How do we process a lack of sameness while honoring what Paul and James demanded that we honor oneness? How do we do that? How do we do that? This is one way Paul did it. This is in 1 Corinthians. Check this scripture out. It says, "But I, brothers, could not address you as spiritual people, but as people of the flesh, as infants in Christ. I fed you with milk, not solid food, for you were not ready for it. And even now you're not ready for it, for you're still of the flesh." Now watch how Paul defines people of the flesh. It wasn't people who didn't believe in Jesus. They were the church. It wasn't people who were doing horrendous things. Watch what he says. He says, this is how you know that you're a person of the flesh. For while there is jealousy and strife amongst you, are you not of the flesh? Woo-wee. In other words, if there's a bunch of envy and jealousy and you're not getting along with each other, is that not fleshly? How is that of spirit? How are you honoring the oneness that is supposed to be present? Actually, what you're doing is you're expecting sameness. So when someone's not the same, jealousy and strife gets in there, and it's a problem, right? That's of the flesh. Now, to me, this doesn't violate my doctrine. This challenges my imagination. If someone said, what does it mean to be a person of the flesh? I would have had a different imagination than a group of people who haven't solved the strife and jealousy between them, a group of people who can't handle conflict. I wouldn't have put that, but that's what Paul said. For while there's jealousy, strife among you, you're not of the flesh, behaving in a human way. For while one says, I follow Paul, and another, I follow Apollos, are you not merely human? What then is Apollos? What is Paul? Servants through whom you believed, as the Lord assigned to each. I planted, Apollos watered. Not the same, but yet one. But God gave the growth. So neither he who plants nor he who waters is anything, but only God who gives the growth. He who plants and he who waters are one, and each will receive his wages according to his labor. For we are God's fellow workers. You are God's field, God's building. Now, let's explore some meaning to this. Next slide. The one serving Jesus is an interpreter of Jesus, but not God himself. And that's a funny line that we wrestle with. There is a subtle line between our interpretation of the master and being seen as the master. Let's say it this way. We have to take our task of interpreting the master very seriously without taking ourselves very seriously. Like, my gift that God gave me, I didn't ask for, nor did I deserve, is teaching. I have a gift to put words around complex things where people get it. Didn't ask for it, didn't deserve it. It's just something God gave me. I find these things easy. And I take that task very seriously. There would not be a sermon you'll ever hear me preach that did not involve 4 researchers over 10 hours putting together a 40-minute talk. I take it very seriously, and I'm very open about this. I do not write sermons on my own. There is no such thing as one person who's smarter than 4. No such thing. No such thing. I have a Bible nerd. Everybody needs one Bible nerd in their life. I'm talking, if I called her right now, it's 8 o'clock at night, she'd probably be asleep, because she studies every day from 4:30 in the morning to 7:30 in the morning. Every day. Now, if she's studying every day for 3 hours, she may as well be studying for me. Correct? And if I called her and she was up, and I said, what did Rabbi Nahum of Akiva say about Genesis 14? She would go to her Genesis Rabbah, that is in her library, and look it up and say, oh, here's what he said about that. Here's his insight on this, okay? Everybody needs one of her. One, right? I also have a historian. So I have also have a historian, a history teacher, right? So if I say, tell me what was going on in Philippi in 47 BC, 53 AD. Why would Paul say that? He can go, okay, well, you got this going on. You got the civil war that's culminating in the Battle of Philippi, and he's got all this. Then I got an elementary school teacher who helps me by creativity, right? So here's the thing. I take my task very seriously, but somehow I have to take the task of interpreting things seriously without ever taking myself too seriously. And as leaders, that is a subtle line we cross all the time. The line between interpreting the master and taking our task seriously and taking ourselves seriously. Let's say it this way. The one working and watering brings all their energy in their interpretation in order to be effective. I do it, you should do it. Then they must hand it over and leave all the results with the master. Otherwise, we'll become manipulators of people. You can't communicate people in a manipulative way without them at some point figuring it out and turning on you and eating you, as Jesus said. If you throw pearls to pigs, that's an ancient metaphor for manipulating people. If you dangle something in front of people and they don't know what you're doing, when they finally figure out what you're doing, they're going to eat you. They're going to eat you. Like, let's say it this way. Have you ever given yourself to the work only to be heard differently? They interpreted you differently than you, interpreted the master. Here's what Paul's observation was. Next one. One person plants, another person waters. Not the same, but the oneness, the God, makes it grow. This requires profound trust and ego work. So I tried to come up with a way to say this in a way that'll stick. This is what we'll say it this way. None of us had the first word, and none of us will have the last word. The tension in the middle will determine how well we handle differences. Right? The work of God was going on before you were alive. It doesn't depend on us. None of us. It doesn't depend on any system. There's been several times in the history of the world that the religious system holding God up got tore to the ground. Okay? And God still survived it. Okay? Right? And that's important to understand. Right? So Nebuchadnezzar comes in and ransacks the temple and takes the priest slaves. So the building holding God up, the religious system holding God up, got tore down by Nebuchadnezzar. And God still continued on. Quick history of God. The God that we attach ourselves to overcame the Egyptian Empire, the Babylonian Empire, the Assyrian Empire, the Roman Empire, the Greek domination, the Dark Ages. I think he can handle the labor government, right? When I hear Christians, like, they panic. They're like, oh God, what do we do? What if labor gets in? And I can see God in heaven going, what are you talking about, bro? We overcame Rome, right? We overcame Nero and Sardis and Babylon and Tiglath-Pileser and Assyria. We overcame these dudes. Are you kidding me? I think I can handle this. Like, honestly, if Christianity ceased to exist tomorrow, God would still be okay. He would go on, right? And so anytime we take ourselves too seriously and somebody threatens or challenges our imagination how something works, we might arc up because we've taken ourselves too seriously. But what the scriptures demand that we do is to handle differences. That for growth to happen, diverse elements have to come together in a unified whole. Just to give you an example, that is water. Water is necessary for all life. What's weird about water is water is what happens when two gases put aside their differences and come together. That's odd. Think about that. So for water to happen, what had to happen? Oxygen and hydrogen had to bond. Here's the problem with that. Oxygen has 6 electrons. Hydrogen has 1. In order to have a stable molecule, you need 8. So oxygen had to agree to be ganged up on by hydrogen for it to be stable. Oxygen had to go, you know what, you're nothing like me, but let's bond. Let's hang out. Let's come together, even though you're nothing like me. Without expecting sameness, could we honor oneness? Let's do that. And hydrogen had to put aside their envy of 6 electrons. You've got 6, I've got 1. Man, where was God when he put my electron in place? He gave you 6, he gave me 1. Man, what happened here? But what happens with water is hydrogen says, even though I've only got 1, I'll put aside my envy of your 6. It'll take 2 of us on 1 of you. But if we come together, we're going to make water, which doesn't create one new possibility. It creates infinite possibilities. So when people are willing to put aside their differences and not expect sameness, but honor oneness, that's when true life happens. It's true of water. It's true of your life. It's true. Your personal growth will be determined by the function by which you allow diverse elements to bond with you, even though they're not like you. They challenge you a little bit. They make you uncomfortable a little bit. The bonding process can be a bit diseasy, but it can be a problem. Let's say it this way. Next one. How often does Jesus ask his disciples or audience, what do you think? How do you read it? Even Jesus, who supposedly had all the answers, he didn't carry himself that way. Jesus was like, hey, is there something you can add to my life? Is there something? Hey, is there a way you're reading this that I should consider? Like this is where growth happens. When somebody, I read a book the other day, and this guy, I'm 43, I have never once ever heard the prodigal son read like this guy read it. Not once ever. It was the most unique reading of the prodigal son I've ever heard in my life. And I sat there at the end of it, and I had to stop reading, and I went, I can't just read over that. I have to wrestle with that. So I called 3 of my friends and I said, let's wrestle with this. This is new. I've never considered this ever. And just in the process of allowing that new information, not judging it, but to be judged by it. That's 2 different things. If we're always judging new information, we just set ourselves up as the filter of all truth. But wait, no. To be judged by it is how we change. Is to go, what did I miss here? Is there something I should consider? And I did it with a few friends. Apparently, the vision Jesus had was a movement that allowed for diversity in the simple as well as the profound. Let's say it this way. To set a table that the whole world can experience the risen Christ requires the interpreter's ability to embrace difference. You got to embrace difference. To communicate across, especially now more than ever, because whatever you say is going to the internet, okay? You just can't avoid it. You can't fight it, right? You used to could preach to just your tribe and tell them what they believe, and they amen you. Now whatever you say is being digested and evaluated across large lines. And so for now, the Christ we have to embrace difference. In this story, there's Paul, Apollos, Peter, and James, and John, who are all interpreting the master for their world differently. And you'd have to do intellectual hula hoops to convince yourself that James and Paul agreed with one another. They said the exact opposite things as one another. Paul says it's by faith alone. In James chapter 2, he's so blunt. He says anybody that tells you it's by faith alone, they've missed the whole thing. You can't have faith without works. That's ridiculous. They disagreed, right? But what was necessary in the growth of Christianity is that both had a voice and both honored the oneness between them without expecting sameness. Both were functioning differently. James was leading the church in Jerusalem who couldn't make that leap so fast. Paul was leading the church in Greece, which had to make the leap that fast. You can't tell 30-year-old men that they have to be circumcised to join the church. It would be a church growth problem, right? See, let's say it this way. Next slide. All the difference is simply part of it, as long as 3 things are true. That God is the ground of being, right? Like, this should be obvious, but if you haven't thought about it, just wrestle with this. If there's only one God, then anything that is true belongs to him. Them. Right? If there's only one God, then God owns all truth, right? Then anything that's true belongs to God no matter what banner it's under. Right? So if an atheist says, be kind to one another, then God owns that truth regardless of whose mouth it's coming out of. Right? If God is the ground of being, Christians tickle me, man. If I had to have brain surgery, there would be a few Christians who are like, is your surgeon a Christian? Don't know. Don't care. I don't want a Christian surgeon. I want the best surgeon. Doesn't matter, So as if Christianity has cornered the market on surgery. Actually, I don't think we have. It's not the center of our gift, nor was it ever supposed to be, right? If God is the ground of being, then all of life is held together by him, for him, through him, all those metaphors that Paul used, right? Then if God's the ground of being, then there's actually no truth we should be threatened by. And there's no truth we shouldn't embrace, right? It all belongs to God. All the truth belongs to God. If God is the ground of being and Jesus is the face of God, in other words, of the Trinity, Jesus is the person we can look at, read about, understand, see how he behaved and interacted with people. Everything else is sort of a guess or not a metaphor. Like it's let me say it this way. Any effort that we have in naming God, we have to instantly dename God, right? So if I say God is love, I have to instantly then go, yeah, but probably not my concept of love. My concept of love is too small. It's got to be bigger than that. Or even if I said, God's a father, I have to instantly say, yeah, but probably not my idea of a father. Because my idea of a father is different than a 3rd century Spanish peasant's idea of a father, which would be different than a 16th century Italian monk's idea of a father. That God's fatherhood has to encapsulate all of those, right? So you got to have naming and denaming, right? Which is why you find debates between theists and atheists so boring. Because a theist names God. A theist says, this is what God is. An atheist says, God's not that, right? But Christianity lives in the middle of those, in the tension between the naming and the denaming. A Christian is someone who acknowledges that if I could think of it, it's not God. There's no way. God's bigger than that. Like, if it's my thought, whatever God is much bigger, right? So Jesus is the part of God that we can look at, read about, see how he interacted with people, learn from that. I love the way Richard Rohr says it. He says, if God is Trinity and Jesus is the face of God, then God is benevolent and he is on your side. I love that. Yeah, it's really good. And the finished work of Christ is what unites us. So those three things, if those three things are true, that God's the ground of being, that Jesus is the face of God and at the center, and the finished work of Christ is what unites us, then differences is just a part of journeying through life. And most of the time, with those three things being true, the differences we experience with each other are simply a challenge to put aside our differences and unite. Scientifically, the word is fusion. Fusion is the merging of diverse elements into a unified whole for the purpose of power. That's fusion. So when people put aside their differences, they honor oneness without expecting sameness, then growth can happen. That's the nature of personal growth. Now, I've got a few more things to cover here, and if I try to cover it in 5 minutes, I'll rush through it, and that'll be bad. So let's take a break right here, because I'm going to shift thought and keep talking about personal growth and communication. And then so we'll finish this. When we come back, we'll finish this, and then we'll talk about how to have difficult conversations. So I'm going to flesh this out in some very practical, here's what you do over coffee with somebody, and then we'll talk about generosity and our role of repairing the world and all that. So.